other guitar players that were in here a minute ago.
They don't want to be ashamed.
That's fine. Cool. So for those of you who didn't get a chance to check out the first one, or that like maybe don't know me as well, I'm a professional session and touring musician. I live in Los Angeles, in Burbank, and I've been doing this for about 10 years now. So, yeah, so unlike the last one, I didn't really give myself notes. I just kind of have like a mental roadmap of kind of like where we're going to go tonight. I wanted to be a little bit more conversational. So at any time, if you have any questions or want me to elaborate on anything, or like I'm completely talking about something else, like just chime in. It's not a big deal. But I kind of just want to break things categorically and kind of talk about like guitar, talk about like kind of dynamics, dynamic range, tone, and there's kind of like what kind of space you occupy and like how to like work with what you have. So a lot of people, just starting right off the bat, do a lot of research on the internet, and they're like are part of a lot of gear forums, and they basically buy into a lot of what people say on the internet, and they think they need to buy this to get this thing, or buy that to get that thing, or like they want to, like they have this sound in their head, they don't think they're going to be able to attain that sound without getting specific pieces of gear. And sometimes there's some truth to that, but most importantly, you need to understand that like you can get a good amount of the way there by like altering like your approach and like how you do what you do. And that's true for like not just guitar, it's true for anything. And so just like really, really learning your gear and learning about what you have. I'm gonna go a lot more in depth with like some effects tonight, like way more than I did last time, especially for a lot of the guys that aren't here that can kind of like pop in and watch online later. So starting off, like a lot of common myths surrounding dynamics are that you need to have more going on to be louder or to be heard more. That's not necessarily true. So my general rule of thumb regarding like being able to cut and kind of like sit in a mix is the more effects and the more I have going on with my actual guitar and my signal chain, the less I play, because like there's only so much room. Like if you have a pie chart, there's only so much room you can occupy, and so the more room is taken up by effects, the less room is available for playing. Otherwise, you're just going to clutter everything up and you're going to get in the way. So what I like to do is I just like the more effects I have, the less I kind of play, or the more simply I play, or the more pulled back I play, and then the less effects I have, I can kind of step out a little bit more, play bigger chords, play bigger parts, maybe play a busier part. And what that looks like in effect is like if I have like a ton of reverb and delay, maybe a little bit of drive, and you have like all these sounds going on, all this space being occupied, like it's going to get cluttered really quickly if I start to like play lots of things, and you're not going to be able to hear that as well. So the more space that I have in terms of effects, I think the better, because like I think in terms of textures. And so if I'm playing a support role on stage and I want to occupy space as a guitar player, and I don't want to step anybody else's range, I definitely want to get in keys range, I don't want to get in bass player's range. A lot of times what I do is I have a pretty good amount of reverb and delay, maybe like some light overdrive, just enough to kind of like push my guitar harmonically to be able to kind of like bloom and kind of like open up and be a little more interesting sounding. But I keep my parts really simple. So a lot of guys default to just like swells, and like that's good sometimes, and like you can do that. But like I don't like defaulting to that. I like to try and find more interesting things to do. I'm not saying I'm against swells. I do them like all the freaking time. But yeah, do them if they're necessary. Don't just default to them. There's a lot of things that guys default to that may be good, but they're doing it just because they think that that's what they have to do in those situations, not necessarily because they know that it's the right thing. So if you do something, know that it's because it's the right thing to do. I may have you come up and play acoustic here in a few minutes, and like we'll just kind of like work out some things. Just kind of give some examples in a little bit more of an interesting way than me just like hacking around. So in terms of occupying space, kind of going down that rabbit hole, let's just start at the beginning of like talking through a signal chain, kind of like talking through a board. Not everyone's going to have the same gear, and that's fine. But again, knowing like the staples of like what to use in certain environments, of how to kind of like mold and sculpt your sound to sit where you're going to need to sit. Kind of going through in order, I'll go through my board first. I kind of walked through it a little bit last time, but I'll go a little bit more into detail. And then we'll just kind of talk about big picture board stuff that like most people have. So my signal chain is, I have a buffer right at the beginning because I have a lot of cables. And just real quick, cables, the more you have, tends to add more electrical impedance, and that can kind of roll off some of the high-end frequencies. And so a lot of guys like to put buffers in their boards to kind of bring some of those back so your guitar feels a little bit more natural, like it does plugging straight into the amp. And mainly, like you could just turn the treble up on your amp, but a lot of people like to have like the most neutral, organic sound possible and then work from there. I fall into that camp. You don't have to have a buffer if you don't want to. I just do because it works for my rig. Go into a volume pedal. I've got a tuner out on the volume pedal. Then I go into a POG, which is, if you don't know what that is, it's an octave pedal. I have had mine worked on to where you can split and do an octave down and octave up. And so, being able to like occupy some different sonic spaces, and like we'll talk about like how you can like kind of use that here in a little while. So this, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about like my overdrive section and how, in my opinion, a lot of people should structure their gain stages. I'm not telling you what pedals to use, but there are general rules of thumbs that have proven to be more successful with how you order them and how you set them up. So regardless of what you're using, a good rule of thumb is to place higher headroom pedals later in the chain so that you can feed into them and you have more room. So if you're unfamiliar with the term headroom, that's basically how much sonic space you have before you start hitting a literal threshold of like things breaking up and not being able to get any louder. Once you hit your headroom, however much headroom you have, you no longer get signal, you just get saturation, you get gain, and that's kind of true just across the board with all audio. But I have 3 overdrive pedals on my board, and I have the highest headroom, lowest gain one last, and then I kind of work backwards for like a little bit more gain and then a little bit more gain. So technically, first in the chain is like my highest gain pedal, and then second in the chain is like my medium gain pedal, and then last in the chain is like my low gain, high headroom pedal. And the reason I have things set up that way is because I like to stack overdrives, and lots of guys do that, by the way. It's a really, really popular thing to do. Like, people have been doing that more and more over the years. Very rarely now do you see people who have like one like overdrive and then like ride their volume knob or things like that. Lots of people have multiple overdrives on their pedal board, and it's a very common thing to do. It's a common thing to stack them. So whenever you stack things, you open up kind of like a world of potential problems with things not playing well together. And so the approach that I take is like, I like to choose my first gain stage to be something that's very low, very light, and that doesn't necessarily color my guitar tone, because I like it to sound exactly what it sounds like, clean, just a little bit grittier. So my clean sound, and then a little bit of overdrive. In terms of kind of sculpting things like that, one thing that I like to listen for and kind of look out for right off the bat is what it's doing to the mid-range, because the guitar is a very mid-rangey instrument. I mean, mids are everything in guitars, and a lot of times a lot of people take too much out or they put too much back in, and it can make your guitar sit really weird, because guitars are naturally mid-rangey. They naturally cut well if you don't do a lot to them. I mean, just inherently a guitar is mid-rangey, but that can be a bad thing too, because that also like competes a lot with the main vocal. You can get in the way of singers a lot too, and so that's where you have to like be creative in how you play around that. But I listen for like if it affects the mid-range, and then I kind of go whether it's affecting the low end, kind of in that order. So first I want to make sure it's not doing anything to my mid-range, and then second I want to see if it's adding or kind of taking away any low end. High end I'm not really worried about because most of the time you can kind of like dial it back or add a little bit more. I'm not too worried about high end because most pedals you can control the high end and make it even across the board whenever you turn it on and off. But the reason I selected the first pedal that I have is because it doesn't do anything to my mid-range and doesn't do anything to my low end. So moving into that, this is, by the way, as I'm talking, this is super, super nerdy. If it's going over anyone's head, or if you have any questions at any point, stop me right away and like we'll talk about it and ask anything. And so just, I didn't say this earlier, but I talked about it a lot in the last one, but I didn't say this earlier, but 100% of the things that I'm talking about, I'm coming at from the perspective of how it's translating at front of house. And so like, I don't think like a guitar player in terms of what I like and what makes me feel comfortable here. I've trained and conditioned myself to get used to how things sound in a front of house mix. And so once you can start doing that, then you can start enabling yourself to be way more appropriate, way more tasteful, and always be able to kind of sit in the pocket that you need to sit sonically. We'll talk about playing later, but in terms of sound, being able to know how your guitar is translating in front of house and then what is happening in your guitar in front of house, what they're having to do to it, can be a really good path to go down to figure out the adjustments that you need to make sure that they have to do less whenever it hits the board and whenever it hits the PA. And then over time, your ear will kind of condition itself to like that being like your home base of like how to dial in your guitar sounds. And so, so moving on from the first gain stage, we'll just, my last gain stage, my third one's just like a higher gain thing. And I use high gain every now and then for certain leads or for certain parts. But even then it's not super high gain. But so I don't really have to talk about that a lot. I'm going to go to the second gain stage pedal because most people, if they have multiple pedals on their board, they just have 2 overdrives. And this is where we get into a lot of problems. And I know like a lot of guys that are probably going to be watching later online have similar boards to what I have. And like you may too, like some of you guys may too, and some of the other guys who were here earlier may too. But like most guitar players that play like in a church setting or play live have 2 overdrive pedals on their board and they like to stack them, or they'll have one for one job and one for another job. But primarily a lot of people stack drives, and so that's what I'm kind of going to go at right now. You can kind of run into a lot of problems in your signal chain stacking overdrives because the first pedal may sound great, but then when you introduce a new pedal into that, it can completely destroy what that pedal is doing and kind of like affect the EQ, affect like your gain levels in like a negative way to where guitar no longer cuts or sits right. So it kind of takes a little bit more effort to find like a number 2 pedal that plays well with your number 1 pedal. So I have the first pedal that like doesn't really do anything to my tone sonically, and a lot of people may say like, oh, well, why don't you just pick another pedal that doesn't really do anything to your tone sonically? That sounds great in theory, but in reality what's happening whenever you stack overdrives, the more and more saturated you get, the more and more low end you kind of pull out because it has to create room for gain. So I like to pick pedals that have a little bit of a low end bump to them so that whenever I stack them, what would naturally go away is kind of brought back already, and I'm still maintaining that same baseline of my guitar EQ not really being affected at all, even though I'm adding more and more gain. And so you can kind of hear that here with going in order from like clean to stage 1 to stage 2. Again, we're not going to go to stage 3 because it's just high gain, and like if you have one, then you know what it is, and if not, it doesn't matter. High gain is not complicated. It's just a lot of gain, and there's not really much you can do with that. Just use it when you need to, but most of the time don't use it. So clean, and then stage 1, and then stage 2. So I'm not really having anything change in terms of low end or in terms of mid range. All that's happening is I'm getting a little bit more gain, a little bit more saturation each time. So, and by the way, you can approach me later. I'm not going to like call out names or brands or anything in here, but you can approach me later and we can talk about specific companies that I kind of gravitate towards that do specific things, both with options, you know, that are like right on par with what everything costs, and a lot of other options that are like a lot more affordable. I use both. I kind of mix and match, but so like I'm not gonna say any brand names or anything or any companies in the films masterclass, but approach me afterwards and we can definitely talk about specific pedals and like why I use them and like maybe why you use your pedals, and we can kind of like download about that later. But like my first pedal is just like the common word is transparent. That word's been thrown around a lot over the years. It's kind of like a gear buzzword to sell things. That basically just means that it doesn't color your tone in any way. What I'm talking about is like not really affecting your mid-range or low end in any way. So both of these pedals kind of do that. The second one is colors my sound a little bit because it adds low end, but I wanted that because I'm stacking it because I want to like maintain where I am. So we kind of went down a rabbit hole of like nerdy gain stages, but it's applicable because like most guys in church situations have at least 2 overdrives on the board, and most of them are usually light to medium gain. And so understanding how to stack them and understanding how to like make them play well together, I think is crucial in being able to like make sure your guitar is still cutting no matter how much gain you need. And like the Joels will probably talk about this in the front of house masterclass too, in terms of like working with guitar players and working with instrumentalists on any instrument and being able to like, no matter what you're doing, no matter how you're playing, like making sure that you can still cut in front of house and kind of like take responsibility for your parts without having to be chased all over the board from part to part. So, so like that's like my overdrive setup, and like that's my signal chain. After that, I just have a clean boost, and I put boosts 100% of the time. I personally like to put boosts at the end of my overdrive chain, because by putting it at the end of the chain, you're taking everything that's going into it and literally just making it louder for poking out. If you put it anywhere else in the middle or the beginning of the chain, again, we talked about headroom earlier, you're gonna be feeding in and you're gonna be hitting those pedals limits, and you're not gonna be getting any more signal or volume, you're gonna be getting more saturation. And at that point, it's basically just like any of your other overdrives you have before that. So understanding headroom is important, and then understanding gain staging is important. So that's why I have my overdrive section set up the way that I do, is so that I can take control of my gain staging and take control of my headroom at all times, so that whenever it's going to front of house, they have to do as little as possible. So on any given day, it's better or worse, but that's the goal. So moving on from there, I just have a pedal that does a lot of modulation effects, chorus, tremolos, phasers, vibes, things like that. I have a pedal that does a lot of different types of delay, and then I have a pedal that does a lot of different types of reverb. So you don't have to have ones that do a lot. The reason we're going to talk about it is because most, if not all, guys that play guitars in this context have delay and reverb. You know, they'll have like a volume pedal, 1 or 2 overdrives, and then at least like delay and reverb. Like that's a very, very, very common setup, and that's why I'm spending so much time talking about this, is because it's like the widest net you can cast with like what guys use in this situation. So, so starting with signal chain, we went through kind of like the first part of the board, and then after the clean boost. Talking about clean boost, by the way, if you just want to take things and make them louder, some people might ask like, well, why don't you just put that at the very end of your board after everything? Well, I don't want like my time-based effects and like my wet effects to be altered in any way. I just want my gain stage to be altered. And so a lot of time-based effects and like delays and reverbs and modulation effects don't, like those pedals, like a lot of the times they're digital, and like they don't really have headroom issues the same way overdrive pedals do. So by putting your boost after the overdrives, but before all of your like, before all of your other effects, is totally fine, because they're not going to be affected by that at all. So coming out of the overdrive section and out of the boost, I go into modulation first, if you have that, and then I go into delay, and then I go into reverb in that order. So I put reverb last because I don't want reverb. It's just a space texture sound. So like I don't want that feeding into other things, and then like my reverb being affected by other effects. I always want that to be last because it's the most environmental of all of them. I want my reverb to be able to dictate what kind of space my guitar is sitting in. So I want it to be last so that I can kind of feed all of my sounds and tones into that and then kind of create sonically what kind of space I want to sit in. And so that's really common with a lot of signal chains. Delay and reverbs can be switched depending on the application. You know, front of house engineers sometimes have different orders, studio engineers sometimes have different orders, even on guitar pedal boards, some people have different orders, but most of the time, at least for guitar applications, the rule of thumb is like modulation, delay, reverb, in that order. So we can touch a little bit on modulation. There's not a lot of modulation effects that get used in worship music and in church settings, and if there is, it's like tremolos and like chorus and things like that. So I have, you know, being able to set up a tremolo for certain effect. I really only use tremolo if the guitar is more prevalent in the mix. There's not a lot of things going on. Because with tremolo, because it's something that pulses rhythmically, I do not want to get in the way of anything that the rhythm section is doing. And I don't want to get in the way of creating like this weird pumping thing that's going to kind of compete rhythmically. So that can be just as abrasive as like an out-of-time hi-hat or tambourine or acoustic guitar. It's like those that just will destroy everything. So no matter how your tremolo is set up, a lot of people don't even have them in sync with time. A lot of people just have them as kind of like an ambiguous texture. If you're going to do that, be really conservative with your depth levels to make sure that they don't overpower anything. It should never go beyond the level of your initial signal, in my opinion, because then you can stay tasteful and conservative with it. You'll hear your effect. It will be complementary, but it won't overpower anything. Chorus. Lots of people know what chorus is. You know, you can kind of dial that in to your liking. I try not to get too heavy on the mix levels either. I tend to keep chorus pretty subtle too, because chorus is another thing to where basically what you're doing is you're taking your guitar signal and like you're very subtly bending it in and out of pitch. And if you can get really aggressive with that, it can not mesh well with other things that are going on. So I tend to stay pretty conservative with modulation effects across the board, because I think that they're just like a nice subtle like complement if you can use them. Moving into delay, unless it's being used for a specific part or a specific time, I typically like delays to be something that are kind of felt and not heard, because again, it's something that's very rhythmic that can kind of get in the way or spill over into other parts of a song. I sometimes have very aggressive mix levels and feedback levels set up on my delays, but that's because they're kind of feeding into my reverb for like an overall texture, which we'll have some examples of here in a minute. But generally speaking, I mean, if you're playing a part, like, I mean, YouTube, the edge, kind of like dotted delay parts, I mean, obviously a delay is like crucial to that guitar part, because the guitar part's rhythmic and then the delay is firing at very specific intervals to craft this guitar part. That's a different situation, absolutely. You need pretty heavy mix levels for that because you need to hear that. But generally speaking, just for having delay as a texture kind of help sustain and kind of carry out the things that you're playing, I keep mix levels around 50% or a little bit lower, and then feedback just depending on how like aggressive I want it to linger. Assuming everyone knows what mix and feedback are. If not, mix is how much of the delay you want, and feedback is how long you want it to be there. It's the same for reverb. This is the simplest way you can put it. How much and how long. That's time-based effects in a nutshell. So talking about delay, I have a pedal that can do multiple types of delay. You don't have to have, a lot of guys have the same pedal that I have, but a lot of guys also have simpler ones that can do one sound at a time, and that's totally fine. I had one that was like that for years. And again, just setting it up to where you can tap it out in tempo so that it's not distracting, and then having your mix levels usually no higher than 50%, because you don't want it to overtake your original, like your initial guitar level, and then just setting the repeats or the feedback to like what's appropriate situationally, you know, for what you need. The general rule of thumb is just like the shorter the repeats, obviously the faster it's going to die off, but the longer you get with them, the more ambient you can get with your delays, and they can kind of occupy a similar space to your reverbs. So you can kind of get away with not having a reverb if you get really smart with how your feedback is with your delay to kind of occupy that space. But most people have reverbs, so we're going to move on. We're going to talk about that really quick. Reverb is another thing that's for me, I see a lot of misuse in the, you know, like a lot of church players that I've been around over the years. A lot of people think that you just need to kill your guitar signal with reverb to be able to play certain styles of music, and 9 times out of 10 you don't. A lot of the times less is more whenever it comes to effects. The same with gain and the same with overdrive. I mean, the reason why I have things set so lightly is because the more you add, the more saturated your signal gets and the less you hear of your initial instrument. It's difficult to pick out what you're doing, and it occupies the space a lot more than you need to. And a lot of times it gets in the way of other things that are going on. So with reverb specifically, I'm very conscious of like my mix levels. I use a good amount of reverb and all the time. I have reverb on all the time, but I'm always conscious of what it's doing and kind of where it's coming in, where it's dying out. So I am a little bit more picky about like decay times, and so like it's called feedback on delays and it's called decay on reverbs. It's the exact same thing, it's just how long you want it to be there. So with my reverbs, I usually never go above 50% in the mix, but the decay is what I kind of pay attention to. You know, how long it's filling over. I like longer decays for songs where I have a little bit more space because then I can fill out a little bit more room, but shorter decays for songs so where I'm playing a little bit more parts. So I kind of have like an always on reverb that's like a room sound, and so it's really subtle, but it's basically like what your instrument would sound like naturally just in a room. It's just very subtle, but it's very natural, and so that's just like the normal baseline one. If I don't need anything more ambient, I kind of go through different layers of reverb, like similar to like I go through different layers of gain stage. I have one that's like light and subtle, and then my next one kind of builds to be a little bit more intense, and the next one is huge and cavernous and kind of takes up a lot of space. Specifically for worship and styles of music like this, a lot of people tend to err more on the side of like the ambient reverbs and things that wash out a little bit more, which is great. I do too, but you need to be really specific with your feedback and your mix levels, your decay and your mix levels. So some reverb pedals have different options that you can carve things in and out. Some are more simple. Even though mine can get really detail oriented, I still really only pay attention to like how much I have and how long it's staying, because at the end of the day, that's the point. That's what's going to make the biggest impact for better or worse with what you're doing. So kind of going through an order with what I'm using, my room sound, which is just very natural. My kind of medium one is usually what I have on like solid 60-70% of the time. So you don't really hear a lot of the reverb initially whenever I'm playing, but you hear the effects of it like whenever I'm kind of done playing a specific part. That's how I like a lot of reverbs, but specifically this one, to do. You don't have to have the pedal that I have to be able to get this effect, but with this specific pedal that a lot of people have, this is an auto swell reverb, and I was very specific about the time to where I play, and then the reverb after my reverb pedal sees a transient from the guitar, then it triggers it, and the reverb swells in underneath what I'm playing, and then it dies off whenever I start to play again. And so it really is only occupying space in between whenever I'm playing. So that's a very specific technical way to dial in that specific sound on this specific pedal, but you can get that effect on any reverb pedal by having a mix level of like 40 to 45%, and then having your reverb decay set around 50 to 60% towards kind of like lingering beyond what you're doing, but because your mix level is below 50%, it's never going to overtake your initial what you're initially playing. And the reason I'm talking about these specific settings is because this is a master class, and this is literally like how you can set any of these pedals up to be able to achieve these sounds that will work well in these environments. So that's like my medium most of the time on reverb sound for styles of music like this. And then I have some other ones that get very, very insane and huge and cavernous and go on for 40 seconds. I very rarely use those, but the one that I do use that's a bigger sound is, you hear it a lot more initially, but even still it doesn't overtake, it never overtakes like my initial guitar part or guitar sound or what I'm doing. So here's like the medium one, it's barely even there, but whenever I play it kind of kicks in like you heard a minute ago. This one's a lot more intense up front, but it still doesn't take anything over. Up front.
Yeah, dude.
It's a lot more intense up front, but the tail end of it is still very similar to the other reverb in terms of just kind of occupying space in between what I'm doing. So a very, very common thing that a lot of people do that I personally disagree with is taking the mix knob and turning it all the way up to where it completely kills your original guitar signal and you just hear the effects of the reverb. Play like lead guitar parts in worship like that with that sound, and all you're doing is just like that. To me is the same as if you have someone singing a lead vocal and then you have a harmony vocalist not singing harmonies but just breathing into the mic. All you're doing is adding a texture and adding a space without anything that's actually contributing to what's going on in the song harmonically, melodically, or from a texture point of view. So the reason why I shy I mean, if you're making a record and that's like a sound that you want to bury and have layered in a million different guitar tracks for this effect, that's great. If you have 4 guitar players on stage live and one of them's doing that because it's a specific sound, that's great. But specifically at CCV, that is there's never more than 2 electric players on stage at one time, and both of the players have very specific jobs. So I particularly shy away from that sound in this context because it doesn't do anything for the song musically, and in terms of the sonic space that you're occupying, you're really just kind of like pulling yourself out of the mix because you can't hear the guitar at that point. There's no reason. That could be any instrument. You can't tell what that instrument is, so there's no reason for you to be playing a guitar at that point. It's just a sound, and so. And a lot of the times sounds like that are in tracks anyways. You don't need to take away a crucial element of the song and a crucial instrument by just having that sound. And so that's personally why I shy away from that. Again, like I said a minute ago, there are situations where that's useful, but 99% of the time in live band situations, specifically ones like that are at this church and in most church situations, it's not a necessary thing that needs to be there. That's just my opinion based on my experience. I've heard it be really great, but most of the time you don't need it. I'm trying to be like really diplomatic with how I'm talking about things, without just like saying like I hate it and that sucks. I would never say that about anything, but I'm trying to like just be like very diplomatic and not just like run stuff into the ground. So, because somewhere like on the other coast, they're doing like a master class, and there's like another version of me talking about everything I'm doing that's wrong. So who knows, man. No, so that's like a general run through of like signal chain, signal flow, kind of sounds, effects. We didn't really talk about like specific settings on overdrive pedals, but it's kind of really, really simple to get whenever I'm talking about how I arrange gain staging and you know, like have your overdrive pedal off and then strum a chord and then turn it on and then turn the volume up until it's even and then turn it off and on and make sure that it's the same level. And then I like, for my first gain stage, I like to turn the gain up just until like I hear a little bit of push beyond what my clean signal is. And then the second gain stage, I actually, for my second overdrive pedal, I actually have the drive knob all the way, like it's on 0. I literally don't even need any drive from this pedal. I literally just need signal and output from it to hit the next one so that I can get a little bit more gain. So keep that in mind. You do not, just because it's your second pedal and your second gain stage, you don't need to turn the drive up on that just because functionally that pedal is giving you more gain. You actually don't need to have a lot of drive on that because just by turning it on, you're hitting the one in front of it with more signal and it's going to get more gain naturally. So again, less is more. Common myth is that you need to have more gain to be bigger, to have a heavier sound, and it's not even remotely true. Across 99% of the genres, even metal and rock, like a lot of the times those guitars don't have nearly as much gain on them as you think. It's about arrangements and parts and how that player's doing their job. And that's why I'm talking about what I'm doing. You know, it's about your parts, how well you understand your gear and like using what you have well, and then doing your job well and occupying that space well. And you don't have to have a lot of experience to do that well. You just have to be open to listening to what's going on around you. We can get into kind of using these in context now and playing, and I won't take too much more of this time because some of the next classes that I think would be really cool to do would be having, I think Ben and I have talked about this, about having like a full band on stage and like having, you know, drummer, bass, keys, guitar, and then vocals, and then kind of going through songs that we do all the time at CCV and kind of like going through ways to like ruin that song with your parts and then ways to like add to that song and make it really great with your parts. And so you can get in the way a lot as a guitar player. Guitars are very dominant instruments. And the reason why I talk so much about subtlety is because I want to create a culture of people that are always listening, not that are like me, but people that are like listening to what's going on around them and adding to that in a tasteful way. So let's go through some like common sounds really quick and like and pair that with some parts really quick and kind of talking about space that you're occupying based on physically what you're playing on your instrument. We've talked a little bit about how effects alter the space that you're in, but like let's translate that to playing. Going back initially to like Kyle's rule of thumb is, you know, the more effects you have, kind of the less you're doing on your instrument, and the more you're doing on your instrument, you need to dial the effects back a little bit because you only have so much space that you can occupy, and if most of that is effects, you're not leaving yourself a lot of room to play, which is fine sometimes, but if you need to play a lot, be more conservative with your effects, otherwise you're going to drown yourself out of a mix, and front of house guy's going to have to pull you down because you're washing across other things that are going on. That's just an objective scientific truth of what happens with sound. So that's not even a preference, that's just what will happen. And it happened to me a lot over the years, and I kind of got tired of not being able to sit where I needed to sit because like I knew the parts and like I had good sounds, but like I was wondering, I just didn't know why I couldn't cut and why things weren't working well front of house, and it's just because my perspective was off about how much I needed in particular situations. So I'm gonna kind of go through just some common guitar parts paired with common effects for a few minutes, and then if we have time, you know, I'll call Joel up to kind of play acoustic, and we can kind of like, I can kind of play some parts around what he's playing, so you can kind of have like a quick snapshot of some of these things in context. But first, I'm just going to kind of quickly go down the line of like what worship guitar players are required to do in specific situations. And so just kind of starting at the top of the list, like let's talk about swells. Lots of people default to them, lots of people go to them. They're great. Again, I use them all the time. With a swell, what a swell is basically is you are taking away the initial attack of your guitar so you don't actually hear anything played, but then right after that you bring the volume up so that you hear the effects of that, and it creates a pad-like effect. So that's the simplest way to put it. Personally, what I do, I have like a longer delay that's a little bit heavier on the mix side, and then I have a little bit bigger of a reverb sound because I'm not actually even playing a part whenever I do a swell. I'm just creating a texture and a space to kind of carry that song through. And that's an arrangement thing, you know, and that can change from song to song, so you don't always have to do swells in songs. Other songs, they work really well. And so I'm gonna go to kind of like my more, you know, spacey reverb sound. I'm gonna go to like my kind of heavier delay sound. And most of the time, because you're not actually hearing what you're actually playing on the guitar, you're playing it and your volume's down and then you swell up. Because of that, I usually turn a light overdrive on, because as it's swelling up, a lot of the initial transients of the guitar aren't going to be there. And I like to have a light overdrive on even in very clean, subtle situations, because whenever that guitar volume comes in, I want something to catch it, to be able to hold on to it a little bit longer and carry it out. And a lot of times if you're just clean, it's not enough, because that's like the most subtle your guitar is going to be whenever it's clean. So I have at least one gain stage on whenever I'm doing swells, just enough to like pull it through and kind of like grab onto it after I do it. And so here's just like a swell that I would do. I'm usually on the bridge pickup, just because it's usually the one that has the most output. It's usually the one that's the brightest and the clearest. And so again, I'm wanting to create a texture and I'm wanting to create a space. So I want to do everything I can to make sure that I have the most that I'm bringing forward for that, but without actually playing it from the start. So a swell in a situation like maybe like the down part of a song or a response moment, we all know where they go. So this is kind of like how I approach my effects with those. Because it's really old. Ideally, that wouldn't be there. That's single coils for you, though. So yeah, we all know the game with swells. You don't hear anything initially, but you hear a lot of the effects of things. They would die out a little bit sooner if I didn't have an overdrive on, and that may be what you want. But and again, your mix levels are kind of dependent on how long you need that swell to be. And so literally at like whatever tempo the song's at, like however many bars you need that chord to ring out in between changes, can kind of dictate how long your effects are going to linger. I like to leave them where they are, and I like to alter the speed and aggressiveness of my swell. And so if I want things to last longer, I swell immediately after I play a note. And if I want them to die out quicker and be a little bit softer, I wait for everything to ring out a minute, and then I bring the level up on my volume pedal, because then there's not as much to push. And so I like to kind of like leave my effects where they are and then kind of change my approach of what I'm doing and kind of react a little bit differently. And they're both accomplishing the same goal, but personally, by leaving them the same and then me having to change what I'm doing, it forces me in a situation to where, again, I have to listen to what's going on around me and I have to react to that. And that, to me, is always the goal of what's going on, no matter what I'm doing with my parts or my effects. I always want to make sure I'm putting myself in a situation to have to listen to what's going on, because if I need to change something on the fly in that situation, I can do that. So, like, coming in right away after you strum something, they'll ring out longer. And it'll be more aggressive and more intense. But waiting a little bit will bring it in a little bit softer, and then by nature it will die out a little bit faster. And so that's really just coming up slower, slower and slower. So that's a more subtle way to do that. But yeah, we all know the game on swells. That's like kind of my approach and my thoughts about it. Kind of moving on. I should have brought this guitar. So, kind of moving on from that, the next kind of two categories that we'll move through somewhat quickly, are rhythm and lead. So these are the two different roles that a lot of guitar players have to fit in on stage. These are kind of the two big umbrella pieces, that everything else falls down underneath. So traditionally, rhythm guitar players are playing more of a support role and kind of keeping the foundation of the song on lockdown, and you're like really just helping everybody be able to do what they need to do on top of that. Lead guitar players typically are playing stuff higher on the neck. They're playing less chords, more single note parts, triads, things like that. And they're occupying more of like a tasteful space and kind of doing things dancing around the vocal melody and kind of like adding like nice little sprinkles here and there. At least this is very much my opinion of what these things should be. So there's general rules of thumb of what works and what doesn't work, but there's no rules. The only rules are listen and do what's appropriate and what needs to be done. But in order for you to do that, you have to understand what will happen if you do certain things first. And so, kind of like you have to know the rules before you break them. You can't just ignore the rules altogether and do what you want. You need to understand, first of all, what's going on a fundamental level so that then you know why you're changing those things in that situation. So kind of moving on into, honestly, the thing that I like more is rhythm guitar playing. I think that I can do a lot more as a rhythm guitar player because I'm holding down something on a foundational level, but then if you get tasteful with kind of your effects and your voicings of your chords and your chord coloring, kind of like how you're moving in and out of that part, you can kind of play both roles. But I personally, I really like rhythm guitar playing more because it's the one that, in my opinion, that matters more. Because if it's not there, there's something that's missing. If a lead guitar or like texture guitars aren't there, it's not really crippling the arrangement of the song, what's going on. You just don't have like auxiliary parts going on. But if a rhythm guitar isn't there, if it's not being executed well, you can really kind of take away. And so by nature, I like rhythm guitar more because I feel like I'm contributing to that more. So with rhythm guitars, I usually keep it pretty light. 9 times out of 10, I have like my first gain stage on, like my light overdrive, and then I can kind of like dig in or pull back to push a little bit more. Again, with the same mentality with my swells of just kind of like setting my effects and leaving them, and then me altering my approach. I like to do that rhythmically too. I switch pickups a lot. I really don't change my delays and my reverbs a ton. I really just kind of like alter what I'm doing. And how I'm doing it. And again, that's because it puts me in a situation where I have to listen and react to what's going on around me. So kind of, a lot of rhythm guitar parts, a lot of people default to just like playing chords and just like strumming chords. With electric guitar specifically, I think it's a bad idea because there's almost always an acoustic guitar underneath you, and that's what they're doing. You are just, the electric guitar is a texture that in most styles of worship music is not something that's strummed a lot. So I think you're competing with what's going on with the acoustic in that situation, and in my opinion, that's that instrument's job and that's that person's job. The electric is there. If you're just strumming, you don't need to be there. You're just doing the same thing but with a different sound, and that's not necessarily beneficial. The electric is there, in my opinion, to be able to add like a different texture, a different tone, something different rhythmically that's going on. So if you have someone that's strumming along and someone that's playing along, and you're strumming and doing that same thing, you're just kind of like working yourself out of the mix because you're busying things up. Because again, like we talked about earlier, the electric guitar is a very dominant presence. It's not hard for an electric guitar to be heard. So I scale back a little bit more and I get a little bit more tasteful with my rhythm parts. This may be helpful to have Joel come up and play acoustic and just like play, we don't have to play song, we just like play chord progression. Sure. And so, basically, the goal here is to, thanks by the way, you didn't know you were going to do this, but you are. Yeah. The goal, in my opinion, is to let everyone who has a job do that job. So in this specific context, Joel is a worship leader. He's the main vocalist, or he's not, but he's playing acoustic guitar, he's playing rhythm acoustic guitar, and so he's strumming. Let's just do like 6-4-1-5 in C, and just like keep it simple. Just strum like 6-4-1-5 in C, and we'll just keep it simple. So Joel's playing a rhythm part. I'm playing rhythm guitar, but that doesn't mean that I'm playing the exact same rhythm he's doing. So like, I'm just gonna let him cycle through. I'll go through different examples of things. So yeah, just go whatever,
It's hard. This thing's been out of tune the entire time.
This is also what it's like to be a guitar player. Cool. rhythmic lead. I'm going to show you a bad example, in my opinion, a bad example first. You've got your effects on, you know. I'm not even going to do that one very long because I hate it. So I'm going to turn this down a little bit because I don't want to power you. Yeah, we all heard why that didn't work because it just completely got in the way of what he was doing. The effects were going ham. You're not doing anyone any favors. And honestly, stylistically, again, this is very subjective, but it's not interesting and it's not there for a reason. You're not doing anything for a reason. So let's do that again and let's kind of go through in my opinion, what a better rhythm part would be. I'm not saying this isn't pure gold, but this is something that I think just in this moment I feel like would work a little bit better, that I would probably naturally see myself doing. So have like my medium reverb, which is kind of like a medium reverb, and then a little bit of delay, and then just a light, a light gain stage. And so in this situation, I'm going to just kind of be tasteful and just kind of add to what's going on. And you'll hear the example of what I'm talking about of kind of wearing both roles of rhythm and lead. But lead doesn't necessarily mean a lead part. It just means anything that's kind of poking out melodically that kind of helps complement the vocal melody of what's going on. That's what I consider to be a lead. It's just an alternate melody or a hook or something that's kind of poking out to be a nice little cherry on top of stuff, But even then, with the cherry on top of the ice cream, you don't want a bowl full of cherries and a little bit of ice cream. You want ice cream. The reason the cherry is so good is because it's the last little thing on top and it's really special, and you get a little bit of it and you look forward to it. And so that's kind of what lead guitar is like. It needs to be just the nice little icing on the cake. And so, in my opinion, anyway, write me a letter if you disagree. Yeah, so let's just kind of go through that again. I'll just kind of play around it. So. That's not going to win any Grammys, but so to A, you never know, man. To A, B, just the difference between those two. The first one, yes, was a rhythm guitar part. Yes, you were occupying a space, and yes, you were using your effects and playing and being present, but it's not necessarily something that's adding what's going on. The second example of what I just played was, in this context, it was letting the acoustic do its job. It was letting this person who has a job do their job. And you're not doing your job well if you're keeping someone else from doing their job. And so by letting that come through and arpeggiating the chords underneath it, my effects were actually contributing to what was going on because they were padding out what was going on underneath me. And harmonically and melodically, I was complementing what was going on. I was picking around what was going on every now and then. I was throwing some different colors and some different notes poking out to make it interesting, but even if you were singing, that wouldn't get in the way. And so that's kind of the approach that I would come at rhythm guitar playing with. Lead guitar playing, I think, is a little different. I like to play what's called counterpart, and so I don't ever, for the most part, I don't play leads when someone's singing. I wait for gaps, and I kind of fill in those gaps in a tasteful and simple way. It's you don't have to sing, but let's pretend that the beginning of the phrase of what he's playing is the vocal, and there's a gap. I would fill that in with something. So we can strum that same progression again, and I'll just play a simple lead around that, and so you can kind of hear what will be going on. So. basically what was going on there is like not very busy and just only a couple of notes at a time and then letting them kind of like ring through and be a texture. And so not occupying a lot of melodic space, but I'm occupying a lot of sonic space. And that's okay if I'm not getting in the way of the vocal. And so those lead parts are actually pretty consistent with what a lot of lead parts would be in that style of music. And so like a lot of the times you're playing like a couple of notes at a time, and this may be common sense to a lot of you guys, but it serves as a good reminder that like you do not need to get in the way of what's going on with the vocal, and if you are going to play a lead around it, you need to wait for your turn to speak. And so being able to be simple and be tasteful and be complimentary, and like those are vague, generic terms, but in this context, we talk a lot about what that means. And so those are kind of like the two main roles of electric that you'll see is like rhythm and lead. There's not like an intermediate role between that. But that's a quick snapshot. The next masterclass will probably go more in depth into the playing side of things, and we'll go through more examples. We'll actually have like a song queued up, and we'll like play the song down, and we'll do things wrong the first time, and then we'll do them right the second time. And I put quotes around that because it's very subjective, but they are things that generally tend to work better and help the situation be more successful if you do them. So I don't want to keep it too much longer, but let's like just have a few minutes if there's any questions, or if you want to prompt into like another point for just a few minutes, we can kind of like leave some space for that, and then we'll be done.
So
Thanks, Joel.
Yeah, dude.
if,
You're the man. Your check's in the mail. My
Nice.
people will call your people.
if on a piano and there's no acoustic guitar at all,
Mhm.
and there's very like upbeat songs where it needs like a lot of fill-in for
Sure.
stress, would it be wrong for an electric rhythm guitarist to just like strum if they felt like it's necessary?
Cool. So if the camera didn't pick that up, basically what he's asking is like if I'm, if you're in a live band situation where there's not an acoustic guitar player and it's more upbeat and the electric kind of needs to occupy some space, is it wrong to play a lot or to play like these big rhythmic parts or these chords that would be a little busier? Not necessarily. I've been in that situation before, and whenever you have those more energetic kind of dancey songs or like the upbeat pop or rock style songs, if you're literally the only guitar player that's on stage, you do kind of have to like find a common middle ground and kind of like sit in a good area of like playing a rhythm support role, but like not getting too crazy, because again, there is more room for you to be a little bit more busy. But in the context of effects, I would still keep effects a little bit more subtle, and I would still remember that the electric guitar is still a very dominant presence. So be careful with how much you're playing. So if you're playing more, if you're playing bigger parts and you're kind of occupying that role and kind of trying to bridge the gap between rhythm acoustic and rhythm electric, just know the changes and know the chord progression and know what you're playing, but be very conscious of your chord voicings. If you're going to play like big bar chords, it's probably going to get in the way a lot. I would keep it a little bit more reserved with your voicings, and then I would keep the effects dialed back a little bit more. I think that's probably the best way to approach that. That's what I would do anyway. So no, it's not wrong, but just be careful, because you can go too far really easily. Yeah. So, any other points?
I'd love a comment on, say, consider a large driving song. So let's use, for example, a song called "Here's in Heaven," right?
Yeah.
So you have this big like instrumental thing that happens toward the end. It's very big. The rhythm is ba 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 ka ba ba.
Yeah.
Very driving. Speak on this a little bit as far as what the guitar is actually doing, and
Yeah.
what part, because it could be very common to go, I'm going to do this with my guitar, da 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 da
Yep.
da da da, and it might even be whole notes instead. So
Yeah,
where's,
totally.
it can be tough to hear those in a record, like what's the guitar actually doing, and
Sure.
talk about most commonly what's actually happening.
So in that song specifically, we're not going to talk about the lead guitar because that's a given. It's a single line. It's kind of soaring. It's like a solo-ish section. It's the main point of what's going on. I think what you're getting at a little bit more is like what the rhythm guitars are doing and like what's complementary of the bass and kick drum and what's not. So there's two different routes that I could take that depending on what's going on. The first one is, kind of like medium reverb, medium delay. light overdrive. Again, the big part of the song, you do not need a lot of gain. You will muddy that up so fast. So again, less is more. Clean, not necessarily the right sound, but like a light overdrive. Electric guitars are very aggressive instruments. They're very dominant presence in a mix. So less is more with big parts of the song. Less is more with big parts of the song. So with that song in particular, I can't remember off the top, I'm just gonna pick a random progression. But like, let's just say that it's driving, you have that. I would either do the first option, which is whole notes, kind of like letting that take over what's going on. So like I have a big full guitar chord with like some grit on it and some effects that carry it through, and like that initial guitar rake is enough of a texture, and that is kind of like a crash cymbal, you know what I mean? You don't need like 16th note crash cymbals going on all the time. That's kind of what your guitar turns into if you're on that big sound and you're strumming like that. So as abrasive as a huge crash cymbal would be at 16th note intervals, that's how abrasive your guitar is going to be at 16th note intervals. So if you're going to go the big chordal strumming route, definitely whole notes, definitely top of the bar accents, definitely like one big strum per chord change. In my opinion, that's going to keep the energy huge. It's going to keep it driving, but you're going to have so much space in between there, and you're going to let everything else kind of like settle in, because you don't want to get in the way of the kick drum and you don't want to get in the way of the bass drum, and those two are doing the heavy lifting and like heavy aggressive parts of songs. So that's how I would do it with that route. The other route, which is a more rhythmic route, I would have maybe a little bit more gain. I'd keep my reverb kind of like middle where it is. I'd keep my delay dialed back a little bit. I would probably actually turn the delay off, and I would just have like my medium reverb sound. But I would do like my second gain stage, and I'd have a little bit more gain. But I would do single note. I would do a single note 16th note part, because at that point you're basically doubling what the bass guitar and kick drum are doing, and you're just adding a layer of like grit and attack to that, which sonically can be a really cool presence. And so instead of the chords doing, you're in this big driving part and you're doing a single note thing, got a little bit more gain. I killed the delay because that's a rhythmic texture that could really get in the way because of how frequently you're playing. But I kept a little bit of the reverb because I still want some space, but I want to be subtle enough to not get in the way. And really insanely overdoing everything on the guitar, and it fit well and it be well. But you've got to alter your playing style a little bit. You have to really be locked into the grid of kick drum and bass drum. You have to be really, really careful not have too much gain and not have too many effects. And so like with parts that are that intense and they're going on that frequently, you need to pick one. You need to pick delay or you need to pick reverb. In my opinion, you can't have both because it's going to be way too much. But because of that, because you're cutting out all these other notes, you're not strumming chords, you're cutting out one half of the equation of your time-based effects, you do have room for a little bit more gain, and that helps add a little bit of grit. But again, the second you start to expand on your part and make it bigger with more notes, you need to dial that gain back a little bit, because you're getting more of an aggressive texture by adding more notes and doing more of a physical rake on your instrument. So you're occupying that sonic space. Yeah, but like that's my opinion of how that would work in that situation. So because it can be hard to hear those sometimes in the mix on the record, and so you're going to go like, well, what do I need to do? I'm playing rhythm guitar, and this is a huge part of the song. Lots of people strum like that, and they've got effects on and stuff like that. Even if you don't have effects on, it's a really intense abrasive texture that doesn't need to be there. You're actually doing the energy of that part of the song a disservice by overplaying. And so it's like you're having a conversation with someone and you just start yelling for no reason. That's kind of what that's like. You don't need to do that. You're already plenty loud. Just wait for your turn. So that's kind of like my opinion on like that approach of kind of like picking those parts out. So yeah, before we wrap, like any other questions, comments, thing?
I got one, and I know nothing about pedal boards, so I apologize if like this is dumb, but before when you were talking about being intentional about setting up your signal chain, it's really easy to run on a headroom. So I'm curious, is the opposite possible too, where you raise the noise floor so far that it just like becomes like a massive issue?
Yeah, so if he's a little bit farther away from the camera, basically talking about setting up pedal boards with headroom, you can, earlier we talked about how you can run out of headroom quickly. And basically what was pointed out is like, can you go the other way and can you like raise the noise floor a lot by how your signal chain is set up and how your gain stages are set up and structured? And the answer is 100% yes. You can. That's like one of the biggest problems with electric guitars is just having like a really loud noise floor and having a lot going on. So it's really important to have good cables, like have nice cables. You don't have to spend a lot of money on them, but they need to be like from a company that like soldered the cable well and that there's not anything going on, any shorting or anything like that. That's the biggest thing that can add to noise floor issues. And the other big thing that can contribute to noise floor issues are amps not being grounded properly, which all new amps are. But having a power supply that's grounded and isolated, because a lot of what guys do in an attempt to save money is buy, like a one spot or like a power supply, that's like 50 or 75 bucks or whatever, but it's not isolated, and so everything is kind of like chained together. And so what happens is what you end up doing is end up sharing power with other pedals, and all of these pedals pull a different amount of current. Digital time-based effects usually pull exponentially more than gain stage effects. For example, my overdrive pedals will pull maybe 7 to 15 milliamps. My time-based effects will pull like 200 to 300 milliamps. And so whenever you get into talking about raising the noise floor, it's important to understand that there is literal, there's physics going on here because there's electricity going on here, and there's power going on here. And you need to understand that enough to know that like you need to buy again, I'm not going to drop any companies or names or anything, but buying a power supply, you can get one for around $100, new or used, that's isolated and grounded, and that means that each output has enough power for that specific pedal that's plugged into it. And so, yeah, you can definitely raise the noise floor, and those are the two biggest things that contribute to that. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, it's just like grounding issues and power issues and cable issues. Those are the biggest things that contribute to noise floors with guitar. Because like single coil guitars, like I can't do anything about the fact that like whenever I'm in my neck or my bridge or neck pickup position, this guitar has a little bit of buzz. Like, I just can't do anything about that. But if I go to my middle position, that buzz goes away. You just can't do anything about that. That's just the way electric guitars are sometimes. That's the way guitar amps are sometimes. Power is different everywhere you go. But generally speaking, having cables that are made well, and then having a good, having your amp grounded, and then having, which again, like 100 out of 100 amps that anyone's ever going to use or buy, they're grounded. So you don't have to worry about that, excuse me. But having a power supply that's grounded and isolated is really, really important, and they're 10 to 15% more expensive than ones that aren't. And so just do yourself a favor if you don't have one and get one that's grounded, because then you're actually supplying proper power to each pedal, and then you avoid the risk of damaging your pedals by under or overpowering them. You can send too much power to certain pedals depending on if they're DC or AC, and then you can underpower pedals and they just won't turn on, or they'll turn on enough, but then they'll have certain issues with, if they're digital, it creates a whole mess. And so, yeah, don't do that. No, but that's a great question, because that's the number one thing of like adding to the noise floor. So, any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I had a question on, it's kind of tone for time-based effects. Do you,
Sorry, I'm saying?
tone, as far as like your time-based effects go?
Yeah.
Are you filtering anything out on like the bottom or top when it comes to like your verbs and delays? Or is it just kind of?
Coming is with delay. It's not as big of an issue with reverb. I mean, it can be, but it's a bigger issue with delay. With if you have like a full frequency spectrum of audio that's passing through a delay pedal that does not have any ability to have filters over what frequencies are being repeated, whatever tone comes through here and goes through there and goes through there is going to come out of the delay pedal. So if I have 80 hertz a lot in a pedal and a guitar, that 80 hertz is going to be pumped through every single delay repeat. And depending on what you're doing, that can cause problems and that can get in the way. But the question was also asked from the perspective of pedals that do have the option to do that. The bigger time-based effects that I have, that a lot of guys have in this situation, do have the ability to have like a high-pass filter on and a high-pass filter basically from the sound world is you're letting the highs pass. You're just setting a limit of how much low end you're not allowing to come through, and then everything past that limit, you're letting it come through. So a popular range for electric guitars is like 80 to 120 hertz of kind of like cutting out everything that's going on below that, because below that you're getting the bass and kick drum territory, and your guitar just doesn't need to be there. And so, and a lot of the times it's not there, and the guitar's really only go down to about 80 hertz on a low E, but someone somewhere is going to like text me and correct me on that. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. I'm pretty sure it's like right around the 80 hertz range. But so on my delay pedal specifically, I don't want that to muddy things up. So on mine, I do have a high pass filter, and I keep mine around like 250, like 240, 250. So you're really only getting like the kind of like mid range and up of the guitar signal coming through, because guitar mid-range lives between like 300 to 500 hertz up to like 1K, you know? It's kind of like the guitar mid-range area, and like that's where like a lot of the meat and potatoes is of guitar tone, and I'm getting all of that from my instrument, and I don't really want that in my delay. So like I kind of filter a lot of the low end out of that. With reverbs, depending on what kind of space you want to occupy, I tend to not get too bright with them because then it's just really dominant and kind of hissy. I also don't get too dark with them either because then they can kind of be warbly and kind of build up. With reverbs, I really do just kind of like try and keep it in the middle and then just like kind of shape what pickup I'm on, what gain pedals I have on and stuff like that of like how I'm swelling into things. But for the most part, I kind of leave reverb kind of in the middle unless I'm really going for a specific sound. But with delay, I pull 2 to 250 out of my delay because I don't want those low frequencies of the guitar pumping through because you can cause rhythmic issues that way. So, yeah. Cool, I'm gonna give it like a few more seconds if anyone has anything else. If not, like we can wrap and be done. Sweet.
Done so.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kyle.